It's been a while since I last made one of these, hasn't it? The Coffee Man's back. Before games like Elden Ring, The Witcher, Skyrim, Dragon's Dogma, Dragon Age, The Secret of Mana, Daggerfall, even before the first Legend of Zelda on NES, there was a game that brought the medieval fantasy adventure subgenre to gaming. It was a simple game with a simple title, Adventure, and it was on the Atari 2600. Now, this wasn't the type of game you typically found on the Atari. Back in the second generation, game consoles like the 2600 were mainly used to bring the arcade experience home, albeit with more simplified graphics and other compromises in comparison to their arcade counterparts, as a console's tech was more limited. So as you can imagine, the Atari's library was mostly made up of arcade games like Space Invaders, Donkey Kong, Asteroids, Berserk, Galaxian, Warlords. It wasn't like the Nintendo Entertainment System Onwards, where you played a game where you go on a journey and beat it. Back then, with most games, the goal was to get as far as you could and get the highest score. But the 2600 had its fair share of ambitious developers that would try to break the mold, and the developer of Adventure, Warren Robinett, a developer that worked for Atari, was one of them. Robinett got the idea for Adventure after playing a game called Colossal Cave Adventure, a text-based adventure game for the PDP-10, a computer that was usually found in university computing facilities and research labs. As you can imagine, due to its sheer size, it was not something you found at just anyone's home. Really makes you think about how far we've come in computer technology. In 1966, there were computers like this that took up an entire room. Now we have something infinitely more powerful that fits in the palm of your hand. Just something to think about. Anyway, after playing this text adventure, Robinett was inspired to make a game like Colossal Cave Adventure, but he wanted to make it a graphics-based game. An adventure game where, rather than using text-based inputs, the player could also move around and interact with objects directly. As you can imagine, this was no easy task due to the limitations of the Atari 2600. Robinett's supervisor at Atari even tried to discourage him from making the game, as he didn't think making such a game on the 2600 was even possible due to the system's limitations, and even basis off of how much memory Colossal Cave Adventure uses. But that didn't stop the absolute mad lad of a developer from trying. In a month, he came up with a working prototype and showed it to Atari's higher-ups, and they were impressed. They saw a potential hit on their hands and gave Robinett the green light to continue working on the game. I won't go into details with the development and all the hoops and workarounds Robinett had to go through in order to bring the game to the system, as this is extremely complex stuff, but what's important is that Robinett was able to overcome these limitations, and Adventure was the end result, and was released in July of 1980. As you can imagine, the game does indeed have a story, though given how primitive games were at the time, the story was simple and in the manual rather than the actual game. An evil wizard has stolen the enchanted chalice from the Golden Castle and hid it somewhere in this unnamed kingdom, and your character is supposed to retrieve and return the chalice to the Gold Castle. The magician has also created 3 dragons, Yorgel, Grundle, and Rindle, to stop you from getting the chalice. On top of those 3, you also have a bat called Nubberub, interesting name, that goes around the kingdom and prolongs your quest by taking and swapping items. Given that this is the Atari 2600, as you can imagine, the graphics are as simple as it gets. Your character is represented by a square, the sword is represented by an arrow for some reason, the dragons look like ducks, and the bat, well, is a bat. But it's not the looks that are important, it's the gameplay and the sheer scale of the game. Yeah, it may not look like much now, but back in 1980 this was considered a real technical marvel. There was no other game like it in a day where games usually had 1 to 4 screens. This game was considered massive, having a total of 30 areas. This game would be considered the Zelda, the Elden Ring, or the Skyrim of its day. It was the first action-adventure game, and all these massive adventure games you see today evolved from this. As I said earlier, your goal is to explore the kingdom looking for this chalice. The game has 3 difficulties, each one changing the layout of the game. The easy difficulty makes the game's layout rather small. The second or medium difficulty makes the game's layout bigger by adding more mazes and another castle to explore. And the hard difficulty is the same as the medium, only this time item placement is completely randomized rather than the set placement of items in the other 2 difficulties. The third difficulty creates a different experience with every playthrough, though admittedly, some playthroughs may be unbeatable since it's completely randomized. The first difficulty is good for a warm-up round, or to get a good feel of the game before you go on to the second and third difficulties. For a game that only has 3 dragons that can kill you, the game does a good job of creating a challenge. In order to fight off the dragons, you need to, of course, get the sword, though since you can only carry 1 item at a time, you have to go about things strategically. Whether you want to go around and kill all the dragons, or grab the items you need and run. Adding to that challenge is Nubberub the Bat, as he can take an item from you and leave you with another when it's very inconvenient. So if you are going around to slay all the dragons to get them out of the way, have an item you need to use, or have the chalice and you're really close to beating the game, you better hope that Nubberub doesn't come along to take it off your hands. As annoying as Nubberub can be, thankfully the game balances that out, as you can also use him to your advantage, getting him to take an item you don't need for one that he has that you want. You can also grab him in order to take an item that's stuck or out of your reach, as he'll swap that item out for another one on the map. Or, and this one's the most hilarious, get him to take one of the dragons away from you. That's just funny to me. You're trying to get away from this dragon that's trying to eat you, and all of a sudden this bat that's smaller than it comes along and takes it away. The bat has no reason to even take the dragon. He just takes it because, well, he wants to. The dragons don't even put up any resistance. They're just like, alright, this is happening. I'm getting taken away by a f***ing bat. Even in the bat's grip, though, they'll still try to eat you if you're close enough. The bat can even potentially kill the dragon if it has the sword, which can work in your favor. It'll even take the dragon's bodies if the bat wants to swap items, which can be convenient if it has an item in its grip that you want. There's also a chance that items can get stuck or get out of your reach, but aside from using the bat to go and get it, the game also has a magnet that will pull items towards it in case that problem happens. The game also has a bridge that you can carry around with you if you're in need of a shortcut, and is even needed to reach certain areas in a maze. You can also change the dragon's behavior with the difficulty switches. On difficulty A, the dragons will run away from you if you happen to have the sword on the same screen as you. You won't be able to kill it, but it will be helpful if you're trying to get an item that the dragon happens to be guarding. However, when you're out of reach of a sword and you happen to find a dragon, it will come after you, though it will hesitate a bit before biting you, giving you a chance to escape its bite. If the switch is on difficulty B, though, the dragons will come after you sword or not, and it will be quicker to bite you. Good thing is, though, you can kill the dragons with a touch of your sword. It's hard to say which setting is tougher, as both of them have their challenges that you need to overcome, so pick your poison. Another upside to this game is that if you get eaten, you also have the option to respawn by flicking the reset switch. All items will be in the same spot where you left them. So will the dragons, though, and if you decide to respawn, any dragons that you kill will be revived, so there's a caveat to it. And if a dragon happens to be in the respawn area, you can escape, but it's going to be rough. Overall, Adventure is a brilliant game that is still fun to play to this very day, and worth checking out. And it's left behind one hell of a legacy. It invented the concept of the Easter egg, as Warren Robinett, unknown to anyone else in the company, programmed a secret room into the game that states the game was created by him, inspired by rumors that the Beatles put hidden messages in their songs. Back in the second generation, programmers and developers received no credit or recognition for their work, nor did they receive any royalties for the games they created. So, some developers would do things like this and hide their names within the game. In fact, this was the very reason why Activision was founded, as 4 developers, David Crane, Bob Whitehead, Larry Kaplan, and Alan Miller, were sick of the lack of recognition and insufficient compensation for their work, and in a meeting with Atari's then CEO Ray Kassar, demanded that Atari put developers' names on the game boxes and pay them royalties in a manner similar to how record labels would treat musicians. Kassar then proceeded to insult them by calling them towel designers and refused to give them credit or royalties, saying that anyone can do a cartridge. Yeah, I wonder if this guy tried to put his money where his mouth is and try to program a game. These 4 programmers, even more disgruntled by these remarks, would leave Atari and found Activision. And I have to say, reading the story of Activision's founding is actually pretty tragic. If only these guys knew what Activision would become decades down the line under Bobby Kotick. Robinett also must have been tired of Atari's attitude towards programmers, as well, as in 2015, he confirmed he put this message in as a means of self-promotion, since Atari paid him meagerly while the company made a lot of money selling his games. Good to know little has changed since then. This hidden room would eventually be found by a 15-year-old kid in Salt Lake City a year later, who wrote to Atari about it, and Atari thought that stuff like this could add more replayability to their games, as they would be like Easter eggs for the player to find. An official policy was then put in place that all Atari games should have Easter eggs in them, limited to the developer's initials. The game, as well as this Easter egg, would also become a major plot point for the book and the movie Ready Player One, which obviously I'm not going to spoil because I liked the movie and I think you should see it for yourself. Say what you will. The game would also get a sequel called Adventure 2 in 2005 for the Atari Flashback series of consoles, and Atari Age 2 years later would also release Adventure 2 for the Atari 5200. The game is also regarded as one of the best Atari 2600 games of all time, if not the best. And it's a sentiment I very much agree with. It's aged very well, so to my audience, if you haven't played it, give it a shot. Yeah, it may not be as grand as a lot of the adventure games, WRPGs, and action RPGs you see today, but they do all have their roots in this, and I think it's worth seeing where it all began.